Oh, well, thank you guys for another Mixed Mental Arts chat. This is from the Mixed Mental Arts community. I am the woke centrist, and we have Kate Fogarty here. And this is Mixed Mental Arts Chats Brown Belt. So we are expecting some others to show up here, but we're going to go ahead and give you guys an overview of what the brown belt is. So go ahead and take it away, Kate.
Thank you, Dustin, and hello, everyone. Thanks to Dustin, aka the Woke Centrist, as always, for setting up these chats. They're so helpful for me and hopefully for everyone else. So this one's about the brown belt, which is idea sex. Hunter Motz's favorite term for mixed mental arts, I'm convinced. But unfortunately, Hunter can't be here because he's really busy having idea sex with his relatives, family members in Kansas.
So wasn't that idea incest?
Well, as we'll get to, idea incest is when it's just idea sex within your own echo chamber. I think because Hunter lives in Los Angeles, you know, via Brazil and England and all these other places that he's lived in, and he's visiting his relatives in Kansas, that there's enough intellectual diversity that the idea sex is totally okay. Oh, and that's the great thing about idea sex. You're not going to get AIDS or genetic diseases from that. So you might come up with some bad ideas, but those are easy enough to get rid of. So we're off to a great start.
As always.
As always. Okay, so let's just jump right into it. So I'm going to start with an overview of what the brown belt is, if you've been following along. This is the 7th belt in the 9-belt system of mixed mental arts. Again, they're a circle, so you can really jump in at any point. Although we did design them to start with white and move up and kind of build on the ideas, but it's totally fine if you're starting with us now. So this is the brown belt, and each belt has its own little catchphrase or, like, you know, easy to remember idea that we're going to build on. And as I said, the brown belt is innovation is idea sex. Or maybe that's vice versa. Somebody can correct me. I'm going to look at it right now.
Well, idea sex kind of like is the precursor, right?
What's that?
Like idea sex is the precursor to innovation?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I mean, I don't necessarily get so literal about them, I guess, because a lot of this, as we talk, I think people will start to be like, oh, I do this all the time. I do this every day. I just didn't even know it had a name. I didn't know I was doing the thing that is so important to do, but we literally all do this all the time. But now our goal is to help give people tools to be a little bit more focused about what they're innovating and what kind of idea sex they're having, just because the better you understand what you're doing, the more laser focused you can be, and the more progress you can make. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, that certainly makes a lot of sense.
Cool. So I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know already or that you haven't already been doing, but maybe stuff that you just didn't quite think about the way that I'm going to explain it. So yes, so the brown belt builds on specifically on the previous 3 belts, which are green, which was about thinking and feeling are linked, and then blue, which was genius myths, aka hero worship, and then the purple belt, which was learn, unlearn, relearn. And so once you understand those ideas, so the green belt is about how feelings control or are linked to our thoughts. So a lot of times feelings are guiding what we think. So if you think I can't possibly be an innovator, really your feelings of maybe confusion or shame or fear of making mistakes are controlling those thoughts, because as I've already told you, you've already innovated a million times, a million different ways, and you're just going to get better at it. And then the blue belt is about hero worship, about how there's geniuses that have these special powers to create things like Steve Jobs or Thomas Edison. And when you actually look at what they did, it's not that complicated. And they had a lot of help. They had a lot of people. They built on a lot of ideas that other people already had. And then the purple belt is unlearn or learn, unlearn, relearn. And that's just the idea that you constantly have to update your skills, lose the skills that are obsolete, figure out new ways to do things, because our environment is changing faster than our culture. And that's how we stay up on what's happening and how we keep ourselves from becoming obsolete. And so the brown belt is just the next level in that idea, where it's combining, specifically the blue and purple belts, that there's no special people, there's no special geniuses that are innovators. You, I, everybody is an innovator. And we're just going to talk more about how to do that. And then, as already mentioned, innovation is idea sex, or I really like what you said, Dustin, about how idea sex is kind of the precursor to innovation. If you want to think of innovation as kind of the final product, then idea sex would be first that activity of getting out of your echo chamber, and bringing more than two or more ideas together and creating something new. Yeah, and as we're going to talk about idea sex, don't focus so much on bringing together the two perfect partners or the three perfect partners or whatever. It's just like, oh, that's a new way of thinking about something. What if I brought that into this thing that I'm doing? And then you can work on getting more specific and refining and perfecting into that final project, which we'll call the innovation. And it's also important to understand that perfection and refinement take time. So we'll talk about a couple of specific examples where somebody might have had an idea and another idea and brought them together, and it wasn't like, oh, that's all they have to do. They had to test and retest and adjust and, fix things here and there. So it's going to take some time. So it's all about execution and not just the idea. And how do you perfect and refine? You have to test your idea sex babies and get feedback, be open to feedback. And one of the things that one of our mixed mental artists, Adam Hansen, who is an innovation expert, talks about is prototyping. So the faster you can prototype and the more you can respond to feedback and testing, the better you can perfect, faster and better you can perfect your idea sex baby. And so one of the ways to do that is to just get rid of shame and fear about making mistakes or looking stupid or whatever it is. And how do you do that? You have to conquer your negativity bias. And as any good mixed mental artist knows, negativity bias is something that evolved with us to help keep us safe. You hear a noise in the bushes, and it's way better for your survival to think that it could be a lion or a tiger or a giant snake that's going to kill you than, oh, it's just your friend Bob who's playing a joke on you. So the people that survived were the ones that were a little bit more paranoid, and that's negativity bias. But now in our current culture, our biggest dangers aren't from poisonous snakes and lions and tigers in the bushes, unless maybe you live in a remote area where that's true. But instead, technology destroying your job, or not being able to keep pace with others' innovations, and so your business isn't able to keep its clientele, things like that. And so now it's important that we all work on conquering or at least taming our negativity bias and understanding when it's appropriate, when it's inappropriate.
Yeah, that
And
seems
then,
like one of the most difficult parts of just trying to wade through what is appropriate and, what isn't.
well, yeah, for sure. And I think really the point is that nobody can do it on their own, like I can't possibly know every situation that's appropriate and inappropriate because I have a whole set of cultural and situational experiences that have taught me certain things. And then when I get into a different environment, it's anyone's guess if those skills that I've learned and those biases that I've learned are actually going to help me. So, I grew up partly in the Midwest in Minnesota where, people don't like you to be super attention getting or standing out too much. And now I live in Los Angeles. And if I want to have a job in the entertainment industry, people think it's weird the other way if you're not talking about yourself, if you're not talking about the projects that you're working on. So that was something I've had to unlearn and learn here. And so really, I don't think there's a book of answers about when it's appropriate and when it's inappropriate. It's just constantly being curious and getting out of your echo chamber, talking to people that maybe have a little bit more expertise in the area that you want to be in or the environment that you are now in, and feeling it out. Trial and error.
Mm-hmm. Trial and error is pretty important, isn't it?
Yeah, and getting over the idea that we are our mistakes, you know? Um, like it's okay, especially with social media. I think like people say something or write something or whatever, and then 1,000 people pile up on that person like, oh my God, how could you do that? And there's shame is a tool like anything else, and there's times when it's helpful. I love what Jennifer Jaquette said. Jaquette said she was one of the guests on the podcast a long, long time ago and wrote a book called Is Shame Necessary? And she talks about how shame is not appropriate in an educational setting. Like if a kid makes a math error, it's not appropriate to shame them for that error. But if people are not paying their state taxes and there's no legal way to put them in jail, or you can send them a bill, but if they don't pay it, they don't pay it, except to name and shame them, and then in that way it seems very appropriate to shame people.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. Certainly.
And then I want to share one of my favorite quotes from the Brown Belt posting that we have on mixedmentalarts.online. And I don't think that I added this. So it might have been Isaiah Gooley or Hunter. If I did it, somebody gave it to me because whatever. But I love this quote. But we have a bunch of fun quotes, so you should go there and check out the belt as it's written. If you haven't, there's videos and other things too. But this quote from Thomas Edison is one of my favorites, and I think it really encapsulates what everybody can really focus on with the Brown Belt. And he said, "Our greatest weakness lies in giving up. The most certain way to succeed is always to try just one more time." And I think that's really the heart of it. Like, don't expect things to fall into place perfectly the first time, or I mean, think about it with walking. I think that's the example that Katie O'Brien and Hunter use all the time. If we were like, oh, humans walk, we've got two legs, and every baby was just like, okay, I'm going to master this, got up and walked, and then never tried again, nobody would ever walk. So it's ridiculous in that context. And it's also ridiculous when you think of learning anything new or innovating, bringing different ideas together, things like that. So let's all keep trying. That's
Yeah, that's certainly, I would say it's very difficult for some people to get over initial failure. It's, in some cases, you know, that initial failure can totally throw people off of a goal. And failure is oftentimes a part of the process. I don't think it's bad. You could use it as a learning experience to move forward. And there are some people that have the mindset that, you know, failure is not something you should encounter, or they take the failure very personally and don't use it as a learning experience.
Absolutely. And that really goes back to the green belt and how our feelings are so strong. We're feeling creatures that think, or feeling machines that think, I think is the quote that Antonio Damasio uses. You know, like I said about walking, no baby is so ashamed of falling that they never learn to walk. I mean, that I know of. It'd be really weird if there was a person that was like, oh, I have the ability. I was so ashamed of all the times I fell when I was, 10 months old, 11 months old, that I just stopped learning. That's ridiculous. And so, and in the same way, like many of us, we're totally fine failing in one aspect, but the more we feel, like the stronger emotions we have in another realm, the harder it is for us to fail, I think. So, if you've been told your whole life that you're really smart, that you're naturally good at math or whatever, and then all of a sudden you come into contact with calculus or something and you don't get it right away, you might start to feel super ashamed, because suddenly it's like, oh, I thought I was smart. I thought I, was naturally good at math and blah, 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 blah. And turns out I'm not, and I'm going to hide from those mistakes or never let anyone know. And that's what we call fixed mindset. And I really recommend people read the book Growth Mindset, or at least listen to the podcast where Brian and Hunter interview Carol Dweck, because you really learn how detrimental that is to our learning process. And to tell kids that they are one thing or another, nobody is smart or stupid. Like, we're all better at some things than others, and we can all learn to get better at certain things and others. And so, like, what's helped me personally is finding something where all I could do was fail, and then just doing it over and over again and getting used to the feeling of failing and seeing that the world doesn't end and everything's okay. For me, I think I've talked a little bit about how when I came out to LA, one of my writing teachers was like, you should try stand up. And if you haven't been at an open mic before, let me just tell you that it's a bunch of failure. Like, that's really what an open mic is. It's just a bunch of people getting on stage with a microphone and just failing constantly. And it's super liberating if you get over that fear of just, especially for me, I have really bad stage fright. I don't like talking in front of people. I don't like being on stage. I don't like everybody looking at me because I'm secretly Swedish. And so just getting up all the time and just failing, I was like, oh, okay. It's totally fine. Like, people still like me. People still talk to me. I still continue to exist. So everything's okay. And one of my favorite blog posts that we ever had was by Christopher Leon Price, where he talks about using video games to learn that. And I think it was, maybe you remember, Dustin, was it Mega Man, the game that he talks about, and how it was so hard.
Mega Man.
Yeah. And apparently it was so hard and all you could do was fail. And, it's the same thing. Like, no video gamer is like, Is that the proper term, or do I just say gamer? Whatever. No, gamer. It's like, I'm so ashamed of losing at Mario Brothers that I'm never going to pick up another game again. No, like, they're just like, this is so much fun. I have to figure out how to master this. And they keep doing it again and again and again. So my advice to people, if you want to get over your fear of failing, start with something where you don't have a huge emotional investment in it, and then maybe try to slowly work your way towards things that you're more emotionally invested in, and just start failing and get used to failure and feel how great it feels to just constantly learning and moving backwards. Oh, hi.
I really
Hi,
like
Andrew.
your analogy with the open mic, because if you think about it, like, your audience is full of people familiar with failure, and it's almost as if you don't have to worry as much. Like, imagine going for the first time and you have paying customers to see you. You know, that would be so horrible. You'd feel so bad that people paid to see you and you're just failing spectacularly.
Yeah, for sure. Although I will say that there are some comedians that are very, very open about how poorly you're doing at an open mic. So just because they're used to failure doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be nicer about it. Sometimes non-comedian audience members, it really depends. Like, you know, there's that whole cliche of like the bachelorette party at a comedy show, where they're drunk and they're heckling. But yeah, but I mean, the point is, just find a place where you maybe, start off with a place where you feel psychologically safe about failing, but don't just stay there. Like, venture out into the big scary world of whatever you want to do, and fail there. And a lot of times people will just take a cue off of your attitude. If you're just like, yeah, I fucked up, or I made a mistake, or that didn't go so well, like, they're like, oh yeah, who cares? Like, it's not a big deal. I think, especially, I was going to say, especially Americans, but now I'm like, I don't know that that's true. But I think maybe especially individualistic cultures, where we put so much emphasis on the individual and on, either you're special or you're not, or you've got it or you don't, that failure is a lot harder for us to deal with. Although, now I'm thinking about it, I'm like, yeah, there is that whole idea of like, in collectivist societies, like letting down your family and committing suicide because you shamed your entire family. So I don't know. Failure is hard. Let's all just get better at it.
I think individual, I don't know. I think it might be harder to deal with collective, because if you think about it, individual failures versus collective failure. In our American society, those who feel that they have shamed their family, I feel, have the hardest time dealing with failure.
Wait, say that again?
I think those who feel that they're shamed by their community, or, the collective shame, I think it's much harder to deal with than individual shame.
Yeah, maybe.
I just think that personally, because if it's individually, it's all based off of your inner thoughts and, your comparisons to other people. But if it's a collective and kind of a social failure, you have other people outside yourself that you have let down.
Yeah, I think, if you're maybe more honor culture and you really prize your reputation over everything, you really feel more of a sense of community, like if you go against those cultural beliefs, it's going to be pretty devastating. You know, like think of all the movies of like honor culture groups where somebody goes against that. Like, you know, is it Serpico where he like starts in trying to weed out corruption in the police? You know, one of my favorite movies, The Godfather, starts with Michael Corleone constantly saying, "I'm not like my family. I'm not, you know, part of my family." And then what happens when push comes to shove, and his somebody attempts to kill his father? It's like, oh, you are part of your family. Like you are exactly who you said you were not. And that's not really the same as failure, but yeah, but those cultural beliefs are, they bind and blind us. I think I've heard that somewhere before.
Yeah, I think I'm just saying, like, it's more difficult to escape, um, like failure that's applied socially than individually, unless you like completely remove yourself from that social situation. I guess
Mm.
in our technological age would be like Facebook and Twitter and stuff, unplugging in that respect. But if it's more of a community thing where you live and it's with the people you interact with on a day-to-day basis, that's much harder to escape.
Yeah, and I think probably the Dunbar number comes to play in that too. Like if you, um, you know, have more face-to-face interactions, you know the people, they might be a little bit more forgiving of your failure than if someone doesn't know you and is just like, oh, you made this horrible mistake. You tweeted some unfunny joke about Africa and AIDS, and I don't know you, but I'm pretty sure you're the worst person ever. Or, you know.
Yeah, there's definitely trade-offs. Like, yeah, like you're saying, all these people online don't really know you, but the people around you, they might have not been thinking straight at the moment, but you're still a good person.
Yeah.
Because we know more than just the tweet that went out. We've been around you your whole life, and we know that tweet doesn't define your whole life.
And
yeah.
whether we're talking about collective shame or individual shame, social media has a very high probability of increasing that shame, because people have that mentality of, oh, that person seems like a fucking asshole from the outside, so they must be an asshole. Let's not take into account what might have led to this particular behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and one of, Adam Hansen, who I'm going to name drop like a million times today, also says, let's stop thinking of mistakes as our limbs or ideas as our limbs. Not even just failure, like just ideas in general. It doesn't even have to be so black and white as like this is a good idea or a bad idea or a failure or a success or whatever. It's like, don't think of your ideas as part of you. They're outside of you, and they should just be shared and adjusted and discarded and updated as soon as you get more information or more ideas.
And that's really hard to do too. And that is one of many things that reminds me of Jonathan Haidt again in The Righteous Mind, which is where he talks about different moral foundations that people have depending on their political and or religious affiliations, and how it's really hard to like if you have the political value of fairness, for example, to question whether that's a valid concern in all situations equally, in the same way that if you have the political value of honor, for example, then it's hard to convince yourself that it's not necessarily valid equally in all situations either.
And, you know, that's just to get back specifically to the brown belt. It's like, and this is one of the things that Jonathan Haidt says so well, is that if, you know, if the more liberal people controlled society, it would be chaos. If the more conservative people controlled society, it would be too much order. You know, like to have a really good, innovative, successful, the best possible group, we need to bring both sides together. And that's really what idea sex is. And so one of the essential parts of having good idea sex, which will lead to extremely successful viral innovations, is to get out of your echo chamber, to talk and exchange ideas with people that think completely differently than you. They don't just look differently. They don't just talk differently. They just don't just live in different parts. They have to think differently than you.
Idea diversity.
Yes. Yeah, intellectual diversity.
Yeah,
and
so that really speaks to basically Jonathan Haidt I feel like his last few books really kind of pounded home how important that these opposite sides, these opposite tribes, all have valid ideas that help society function. But if we kind of take any extreme side of any of these things, then we'll see the degradation of society. So he basically says we need everyone's ideas, and the more different and diverse amount of ideas that we get, the more we're able to make some type of progression socially.
For sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, I follow him on Twitter, and I see some of the responses that are just like, you know, he tweeted something the other day about, I think he was like retweeting somebody else, and the basic idea was that, you know, exactly what we're talking about. Like, you need intellectual diversity, you need both sides. Stop wasting your time hating the other side, and start interacting with them and whatever. And you know, the people are like, well, I will always hate white supremacy, I will always hate whatever. And it's like, sure, but then we go back to you know, our hero, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting his name. Dustin,
Daryl
you know
Davis?
who I'm talking about. Daryl, well, yes.
Talking about Daryl Davis?
Daryl Davis, yes.
My hero too.
Yeah, and it's like, I don't know that there's numbers or there's stats, but I think it's pretty likely that he has done more to convert people out of the KKK than some other movements like Black Lives Matter. And that's not to say that we shouldn't have Black Lives Matter. Like, we need diversity, but there's not just one right way of doing things. And look how successful he's been getting, is it over 200, what are they called? Cloaks, capes?
I think he says that he has at least 40, you know, leadership cloaks.
Mm-hmm.
And then because of the leadership leaving, that also broke up a lot of the underlings from some of these clans in different regions. So he says he has about 40 robes, but he also believes that because of the collection of these robes, that he can point to members leaving because of converting some of these leaders.
And he also has a bunch of other clan memorabilia that might not necessarily be robes that people who have left have also given him.
And really, what is he doing? He's just having idea sex. You know, they probably don't want to refer to it as that, but he's having conversations with people that think differently than him. And, you know, without any kind of agenda, really. Like, he's just with curiosity. He's leading with curiosity. And how easy it is to just talk to people no matter what, if you can find some mutual, I think like music was the big thing for him because he was a musician, where he at least started with that, where he just talked music with these other guys. And yeah, and that's really what he's doing. And he's innovating ways to fight racism. He's a racism innovator, or I don't know. That might not be the right title.
Yeah, one of the most important things he says that he brings up repeatedly, and it's pretty much true, is if we're not talking, we're fighting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You know, and there's a lot of people that would be like, oh, we just sound like a bunch of hippies and whatever. And I think besides Andrew, like, none of us are hippies.
I'm a hippie.
True. Andrew's a hippie, but we need that intellectual diversity, you know? And
I'm actually kind of more of a hippie / jock / nerd.
Okay, there you go. But yeah, and so I think we were talking about getting out of your echo chamber and how essential that is. So yeah, this is what I think is really important to remember too. It's like, whatever goal you have or problem you face, or I don't know, maybe it's just those two things, you can innovate your way out of it. So if you care about social justice, you can find innovative ways. Like, you know, take some of the things that one group is doing, see where they're successful, take something that other groups are doing where they're successful. If you know, if your job is at risk for, you know, it's changing so much because of creative destruction or innovations in technology, et cetera, like, do what John Aguilar does or Jenny Aguilar. It's like, innovate new ways of doing those things. Like John, as we've talked a lot before, he's a stonesmith, and he innovates using new methods, new technology, new ideas of design to do this really ancient stone building. You know, it happens in art all the time. You know, like Quentin Tarantino's entire career is based on idea sex. Like, you know, he got a lot of those ideas from all of the movies that he loved watching when he worked at a video store.
And then he innovates them, like how he made a heist movie where he doesn't show the heist with Reservoir Dogs.
Yep. You know, Pulp Fiction is pulp stories told backwards.
And out of sequence.
With, you know, actors like John Travolta, who at that time hadn't had much of a career in 20, 30 years, something, a long time. You know, so whatever problem or goal that you have, you have to innovate to be successful, really. I think we can even be that strong and to say, like, you have to innovate.
And also, I think it's important to remember that often having idea sex with people who have ideas that seem dangerous to you can be really educational. Like, one of the things I was reminded of when you were talking about Daryl Davis is that one thing I learned from watching his documentary, Accidental Courtesy, is that there are more different varieties of the sort of scary idea of Nazis and white supremacists than I thought there were. Like, I just kind of assumed that all of those hate groups like Nazis, I thought they were all kind of the same in a way. I thought they all kind of literally sympathized with Hitler. But one thing I learned from learning more about those sorts of ideas in that movie is that it's not necessarily like they all have ideas that I disagree with fundamentally, but not all of them, for example, think that there should be a white genocide. Like, there are some groups who do, and there are some groups who don't.
Yeah. Well, and that reminds me too of I can't remember
black
his name.
genocide, not white genocide. That wouldn't make sense.
Yeah, I think I think they probably all feel like there's some kind of white cultural genocide, whatever that means.
Yeah.
But there's another guy too, and his name escapes me right now, but he was or is the son of the leader of a white supremacist group that I think they run Stormfront. Does that sound familiar? Is that like
Yeah.
yeah, anyways, he went to, he was he was slated to be the next leader of this movement. And he'd already entered politics at like really young, I think like 16, and was finding new ways to innovate the message of this group. And then he went to college. And then he started hanging out with people that were different than him. And this is very like condensed version of what happened, but there was a Jewish student that went to the same school with him who constantly invited him to his Seder dinners. And
what are those?
So I'm not an expert, but it's a dinner where you invite people, and part of the Jewish tradition is to talk, and it's like a dinner party. There's probably like specific other rules to it that I don't know about, but I think they're usually Friday nights or maybe Saturdays. And he had an interfaith Seder that he just invited people to, and so it was just a big idea sex orgy, with food, so even better. And eventually he kept inviting this kid, because eventually people on campus found out who he was, because the internet exists and nobody can hide. And some people were just like, oh, we have a white supremacist on campus. And this guy in particular, and I think there were other people too, were just like, well, let's talk to him. Let's hear his side of the story. And eventually he started going to those dinners, and all of a sudden it gets really hard to hate people. The way that Daryl Davis shows, it gets really hard to hate people once you get to know them. And so now he's turned his back on that movement. And I heard him on NPR not too long ago on Fresh Air. He had co-written a book with another guy talking about what Stormfront is doing and his journey out of that. And yeah, and it was all because he started having idea sex with people.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's that reminds me of what you were saying there of one thing that Daryl Davis says throughout that documentary, which is, how can you hate me if you don't even know me? And then he applies that to the people he talks to also. If you get to know someone and they become your friend, they're much more likely to agree with some of your ideas.
Yeah. And like, also, agreement isn't even necessarily the point.
Yeah,
it's like, if we all agreed, how boring, how terrible, then we'd have to, find aliens to have idea sex with. Like, agreement's not the point. And I think that's another thing that is really important about the brown belt too. And it's like, you're not necessarily doing these things so that you can pull people to your side. You want to be affected by them in the same way that they affect, or you're affecting them, because that's how you can build.
You want to do you want to be fucked too. You don't want to do all the idea fucking.
Yes. Very well put. Yeah, I mean, if like, it works with everything. Like, if you think about art, it's like, if Quentin Tarantino had just remade all the movies that he loves, scene by scene, maybe people that hadn't seen them would be impressed the first time, but he wouldn't have such a long sustaining career if he hadn't put his own twist on it. Like Tarantino has become a whole genre of film now, and he didn't invent anything. He's just bringing different things together. Not just, or the same ways, like, he's not just totally you know, he's very much like paying homage when he wants to do that, like, and then, you know, changing things when he wants them to be changed.
And that's like how science works too, right? Like when I was tutoring one of my students the other day, we were looking up who invented the periodic table, and unsurprisingly, it said this one guy whose name I forget, but it was this old guy, and it said that he built on the work of these three other scientists, and it was probably way more than three other scientists.
Yeah, I'm sure. I think was that Oscar Periodicus? Is that the guy?
That's not
I'm
who
totally
it said.
kidding. That's a really bad joke. It's terrible. I'm not a dad, but I could be based on my humor. And now you understand why my open mics were such journeys of failure.
I feel like if I tried to do stand-up comedy, I would be one of those comics who just goes into angry rants about stuff.
Sure, there's lots of those. But, I mean, that's the whole thing is you eventually, if you do what Katie O'Brien and Hunter Motz call focus practice, then you start to, you know, the nice thing about doing stand-up on stage is you have real-time feedback. People are either laughing or not laughing or booing or clapping or falling asleep or whatever it is. Like you start to get a lot of like, oh, if I want to do better at this, like how can I hold their attention? And, you know, and some angry rant style comedy works well for people like Lewis Black and, you know, others. But yeah, so I think that pretty much covers the overview of the brown belt, unless you guys can think of anything that I missed.
I missed the start. I don't remember. What's the basic principle behind the brown belt?
So it's just that innovation is idea sex, or as Dustin put it so nicely, idea sex is the precursor to innovation.
Okay.
So if we're thinking of innovation as the successful end product, idea sex is the way that you get there. And so idea sex is just two or more ideas coming together. And you can do that on your own. You can, you know, one of the examples we use in the blog post is Reese's peanut butter cups. You know, one person can bring chocolate and peanut butter together.
That was a great idea.
Yes, or like bacon and donuts. Put those together. You know, there's lots of those ideas. But to get better idea sex, you want to break out of your echo chamber and you know, get more intellectual diversity. So things like Kogi Barbecue, which is Roy Choi, he grew up in LA, he brought together taco truck, like LA taco truck food, and mixed it with Korean food that he grew up with. And so those are wildly more different than maybe chocolate and peanut butter. And he, you know, tinkered and worked and eventually made a really successful restaurant business out of that pairing.
For sure.
And let's see, what else did we talk about before you got here? That's basically it. I mean, the nice thing about the brown belt is, like I said, like we already all do all of this stuff. So I'm sure people listening or reading this later will be like, oh, remember that time that I mixed whey protein with coffee? That was idea sex. That's something that Hunter Motz did.
Really?
Yes. I'm pretty sure it was whey protein. I was not around in the coffee whey protein idea sex years, but I heard from Katie O'Brien that it was terrible. That was disgusting. But you know, that's the thing. It's like you tried it, didn't work, move on, try something else. But
I tried mixing coffee.
like that,
Sorry, I interrupted. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say I tried mixing coffee with green tea once because I heard that smart caffeine that biohackers take is basically caffeine with one particular, I think one particular micronutrient in green tea, where if you combine it with caffeine, it amplifies the effects of caffeine. So I tried mixing them a few times once and it tasted horrible.
You can imagine that would be horrible. Also, doesn't green tea have caffeine in it?
I think it does, but a really small amount. So I wanted like some sort of caffeine supercharge thing.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, you should talk to Hunter. You guys can you guys can work out your coffee problems. It's always fun to make fun of Hunter when he's not around. But
Crucially.
yeah. What's that? Crucially. Yeah. I haven't heard him say that one so much. I guess we shamed it out of him. So I kind of miss it. Kind of miss it, to be honest.
I think I heard him say it on the last chat.
Oh, did he? Okay, good. Phew. I don't want it. I don't want it gone. I'm a fan of Crucially in moderation. But yeah, so the thing about the brown belt is so easy because we all do it. If you have kids, you've innovated genetics. You know, you've gotten with somebody else, mixed your genes together and created something new and exciting, your child. And, you know, people do that all the time. Like, even back in Shakespeare, he didn't come up with any of those stories that he wrote plays about. They were either stories that existed that he just made into plays using poetry, or that's it. Like, I think all of his plays are based on historical things or stories that already existed. If I am correct. If I'm not, well, then I just made a mistake. Good for me.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I'm not at all well versed with Shakespeare.
Yeah, I'm not an expert. I'm like a off-brand English major, but yeah, I remember hearing that. Same thing with Alfred Hitchcock, and Stanley Kubrick. They didn't write any of the stories; they adapted them,
and a lot of them were based on books, or at least
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I just watched The Shining the other night, and that's based on a Stephen King novel. And Stephen King actually hated the movie version of The Shining because it was too different for him. But a lot of people, I've never read The Shining, and I'm sure it's very good, but a lot of people say that really the movie is superior because, you know, it's an innovation on that. And even The Shining, like, draws on a lot of other story tropes. So we all innovate all the time. And this is just about how to get more specific about it. So, or more intentional about it.
I also heard from my friend the other day who's reading the book 2001: A Space Odyssey that actually, apparently, the book was being written as Stanley Kubrick was making the movie, and and it was originally a short story, and then it was a screenplay that was being written at the same time as the novel.
Yeah. I'm not familiar, but I think that sounds totally logical or not logical, but totally plausible. I mean, that happens a lot in Hollywood too, because you need to secure the rights to a story so that you can make a movie off of it, because there's intellectual property rights and stuff like that. Like, you know, The Social Network by Aaron Sorkin, that was based on a book, but from what I've heard, it's very different from the book because they were both being created almost simultaneously. But, you know, it's just easier to secure those rights and stuff like that. But yeah, and like with the 2001 Odyssey, like Space Odyssey, that could be an example of where they're both affecting each other, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would really invite anybody to think of their favorite show, movie, piece of art, whatever, and like look deeper into it, and you might see that it's based on something else. It's an innovation of something. You know, one of the guests that Hunter and Brian had on, Alan Gannett, wrote a book called The Creative Curve. And I really recommend it. I actually put it in the list of supplemental materials for this chat. It's all about, Alan Gannett has made a career out of finding patterns in things. And so he's found the patterns for successful creatives across fields. So you think of music composers or like music writers. What do they do that's similar to what Ben & Jerry's does to create the best ice cream flavors? And a lot of it is innovation, taking something old, mixing it with something else, or not necessarily old, but taking one thing, mixing it with another thing. And he talks about trying to find the perfect formula of just new enough. So that's another thing. I don't know that we should get into it here, but there's a whole idea of if something is too new, it's going to either fly over people's heads or they're just not going to like it. But if it's not new enough, people aren't going to be interested in it. And Adam Hansen talks about that a lot too. Like you have to find the right mix of new and familiar so that people will like it. And, you know, a lot of the most viral movies or stories or things that like really get into the zeitgeist are things that are just new enough. So one show that people love to death, Stranger Things, you watch that show, it's like just a hodgepodge of 80s horror movie tropes. Like literally some scenes, like the scene in E.T. where they are on bikes and they fly over the scientists that are coming after them, or the police, I think, that are blockading, whatever it is. They do almost that exact scene in the first season of Stranger Things. And people loved it so much because it was familiar enough, but also all these things get combined into one entertaining story on Netflix that you can binge watch at your convenience.
For sure.
And we already talked about the Korean barbecue burritos from Roy Choi. Even Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is based on British history, like the War of the Roses, but then mixed with fantasy.
Yeah.
And iPhones, we talk about this in the blog post. iPhones are computers mixed with cell phones, mixed with music players, mixed with great design.
And a watch.
And what?
And a watch.
And a watch. Now a watch, yeah. But at the time when they first came out.
No. I mean that there's a watch in all phones.
Oh yes, yeah, yes, and a watch. There's a thing in LA called Pop Cultivate. So we have, we had food trucks. We still have food trucks, but now we have a lot of pop-up restaurants, and it's probably it's probably a common thing in a lot of big cities because rent is often so high that, you know, if you're prototyping a restaurant, you don't necessarily want the risk of signing a lease and paying this astronomical rent. So people will just rent part of an existing place. So like one of my friends who was on the Orange Belt podcast is Kara. I call her Kara Calabama because her business is called Calabama. But she works with another pop-up called Pop Cultivate. What they have done, they've released just like, you know, short-term rent. They have, I think it's like 25 people come to their restaurant. It's high-end Chinese cuisine. So there's 3 chefs, her and Chris Yang, and I forgot the other woman's name, but anyways, 3 really good chefs. They have the fun of pop-up restaurants mixed with high-end Chinese cuisine, and then they mix it with marijuana. So you have laced high-end Chinese food, and it's super popular. And they didn't invent any of those things.
I think the last part is why it's so popular.
What about the innovation that I have you working on, Andrew?
What's that?
Your experiment with the scrapings.
Oh yeah, collecting the ash from the weed that I smoked to make it into edibles. Yeah, I still got a fair bit of ashes there. I think I should be able to try that experiment fairly soon.
Well, you would probably have to combine that with like chemistry as well, right? Like, I don't know a ton about it, but from what I've heard, that there's ways of unlocking THC with fat and combining these things all together. I mean, a lot of good baking and cooking are related to chemistry.
That's a good thing to remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like combining what seem like opposing flavors in cooking often works too, like sweet and salty, for example. Those are really good contrasting flavors that you wouldn't think that they would seem like they would work good together, but then when you do, they often do work really well together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like barbecue chicken.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's a place in Santa Monica called Sidecar Donuts, and the best donut I've ever had in my life is butter and salt. And it sounds weird, but it is the best donut I've ever had in my life. It's so good. It's sweet, salty, but not too sweet, not too salty. And then it's a donut, so it's delicious.
And maple bacon donuts are good too.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so innovation is just a constant thing. But let's see, what should we talk about? So we could talk about, I like the idea of you repurposing your marijuana ash for for food. I'll share with you an idea that I have had that I'm probably not going to, see to fruition. So anybody that hears this and wants to take it and run, go with it. But I love the idea of scarerobics. It's combining horror movies with exercise. And as I was thinking before the chat, I actually think that a movie is too long because you really want like a workout class to be about an hour, maybe 45 minutes, an hour. So what you need is a theater with a projector screen. And then instead of chairs, you have maybe like stair climbers or, I don't know, what are they, elliptical machines, something like that. And then you put on terrifying shows. So how I thought of this idea was I was watching The Shining once when I was at a gym and they showed movies every once in a while. Or no, it was on the television. Like they have TVs in gyms. And The Shining was on, and the last 20 minutes, is running through the labyrinth outside. Jack Nicholson is coming to get the kid and all this stuff. And and I was watching it and I was just like running. And then by the end of my workout, I was like, oh my gosh, I just worked out really hard because I wasn't even thinking about exercise. I was so caught up in the story that I was watching and them running and I was running. And I was like, what a great idea for an exercise class.
You mean like it can provoke your adrenaline? It can improve your adrenaline rush?
Yeah, I mean, sure. But also, have you ever, you're watching a movie and you find yourself like clutching a blanket or something because you start to get really tense, like your muscles get activated by the emotions that you're feeling. And so put those into good use, like start running, start doing that. But I was like, what if there was a show that was designed, like how they create music playlists for certain workouts? What if there was a show designed to have those emotional ups and downs to like match to your workout.
Yeah.
So there you go, internet. I give that to you. Somebody perfected.
Yeah, that'd be cool if it's totally in sync with the parts of your workout like that.
Yeah, I mean, for people, I can't remember the name for them, but there's people that hate listening to music, and maybe listen to stories or whatever. I mean, the same idea could be done with audio stories too. It doesn't have to be visual, but since there's already so many screens in gyms, like let's put those to use.
Well, you can make some type of VR aerobics where you like have a headset on, and then you put them in some type of virtual environment where it's like Jason is chasing them. So, you know, they have to get like a certain heart rate or else like Jason comes inching closer and may jump scare them if they don't get back to the specific heart rate.
Well, and it's like think of Dance Dance Revolution, how that was like workout and video game, but like now you add VR and you know, all of a sudden it's the Matrix. Like you're learning Kung Fu in this virtual world and you're getting your workout because your body's actually doing it. I think we're on to something, guys. Let's end the chat. Go. Just kidding.
Adding the VR to it too sounds like making more realistic a mental idea that a lot of people use. Well, the sort of mental idea that a lot of people use when doing a hard workout too. Like I use this because I've heard it from other people before, but more recently I heard Aubrey Marcus talking about this idea where when he's doing a workout, he imagines that if he doesn't go hard on this workout, there are warlords coming to slaughter his entire family. So if he doesn't work out hard enough, warlords will slaughter his entire family. And that could easily be very fucking visceral in VR.
Can you imagine how dark that would be if like you're working out and the teacher's like holding up, you know, your family members and it's like, I'm going to kill your wife or your husband if you don't do 20 more push-ups or whatever it is. That's pretty.
If you don't get that last rep, a gun is going through her head.
Yeah, that's. I don't know. We might need to keep working on this idea.
I still have kind of an extreme mindset from when I competed in powerlifting.
Yeah. How about you, Dustin? What are you innovating?
Are you there, Dusty?
He might have stepped away.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute it. Okay. I think it just being a creative person in general, you just always kind of inherit. I won't say inherit, but when you're someone who's engaged in creative processes, I think it's almost a talent that you kind of know how to mash things together to create something new. And that's typically anytime you're inspired by something and you're creating something new from that inspiration, I think that's also part of innovation as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because for me, it's typically like if I'm talking about my game design stuff, a lot of my own designs are based off of the experiences I've had with past games I've played and how to either mash genres up into creating something new or thinking about something that I played that, hey, I think I could have improved this part of the game by doing this. But it's just basically taking my experience and my experience with, you know, creating things and just kind of mashing ideas together to see what I can come up with. And, you know, there's always failures too. Like I've done things that have failed and then I've always learned because in games, there's always feedback. You know, you get ratings, you go on the forums and see what people are hating on. So there's always a good amount of feedback But you get positive feedback as well when you know you're doing things right. Like one of the projects I worked on, I guess it was like a challenge system that was expressly made to challenge people. And I wasn't the only person working on it. It was me and another person. And I was glad when they said, yeah, this specific level is super hard. And I feel super accomplished that I was able to beat it and get the achievement. And that made me feel good because that was the purpose. Like, I really wanted to challenge them, but not so much that it felt really cheap, like not a real challenge, but like a challenge, an unnecessary challenge.
Yeah. That reminds me of I was working on this writing challenge recently that was on Prose, this website that I do different writing contests on often, which is write a terrifying haunted house story in 25 words. So it's really cool because you have to use a really strict economy of words and use the right words in exactly the same place, because that's pretty fucking challenging to write a convincingly horrifying story in 25 words. And with what you were saying about how for creative people it can be almost an automatic thing to combine different creative ideas, Dusty. Like that can happen at a subconscious level too, like particularly for writing. I know I'm not alone in that, especially when I'm writing fiction, the ideas will just come out. And then when I look back at the first draft after, I'll think, oh, I got that idea from that science fiction movie I watched recently. Oh, I got that idea from that novel I read recently, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, because I think our innovations are very much based off of our own personal experiences and solving problems in our lives. Like I know that's a big case for like people who invent things. You know, they're usually trying to solve a problem that they've personally experienced, and they use some of the ideas that they draw upon from their personal experience to create this innovation.
That's like how Nassim Nicholas Taleb's most recent book is called Skin in the Game. Like one of the many ideas in that book is about how you're better at coming up with a solution to a problem if you have skin in the game, if you have personal investment in it.
Yeah, that sounds like I think that's pretty much true. Like the more investment you have into it yourself, the more likely you'll be able to solve that problem for yourself.
Well, and that kind of goes back to the whole idea of the Dunbar number, right? Like when you know people and care about them, then you can see, you know, the more as a human and care about them. And I think it's the same thing with ideas and problems. It's like I care very much about plastic, getting rid of plastic, because I grew up on a sailboat in the Caribbean and saw all the trash. Still see it, still see the trash in the ocean. And so that's a problem that I'm familiar with and I care about it. And I feel like I have skin in that game. And so I'm, you know, in my own small way, trying to think of ideas to innovate that, innovate better solutions for that. I was just looking through the comments on YouTube real quick. Somebody said, get rid of the idea sex condoms. I love that. Like, yeah, you're not going to get...
That is a great idea.
You're not going to get
unprotected
an STD or a genetic disease from having idea sex. So just, you know, get crazy.
Don't even use birth control, because then you can have idea sex babies too.
Yeah, it's all it's like the 60s in your brain. I don't know. And then somebody else.
Wouldn't that be bad though? Like protecting yourself against ideas? Because wouldn't the idea sex condom kind of be like, I don't know, what would be a good metaphor in discourse for the idea sex condom?
I don't know.
I mean, the idea that the idea that some ideas are dangerous.
Yeah.
You know, I like I am liberal, and I feel I very much relate when I hear people say things like, "Oh, we shouldn't entertain these ideas because they're dangerous." On the one hand, I totally get it, but I think not allowing people to talk about them isn't the way to deal with dangerous ideas.
For sure.
I think, go into the basement, use another metaphor, just build metaphor on metaphor. Go into the basement and see the boogeyman, and then see it's not that scary and be like, oh, I don't want to hang out with that guy. Did I just mix too many metaphors? I just think, it's like, are people going to become Nazis from reading Mein Kampf?
No. I've read it. I've read it, and I'm not a Nazi.
Yeah.
It actually helps you. It kind of.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. It can help you understand at least a little bit better how Hitler got to the place where he did some of the things he did. Like he talks in the book from his own perspective about things like how his father would beat him, his mother wouldn't do anything about it. He felt socially isolated when he was growing up, and he would eat his lunches alone. And everyone knows about how he was rejected from art school and that sort of thing, which doesn't excuse him leading to the mass genocide of millions of people, but it helps explain how someone can end up that way. And with what you were saying about how we should get rid of this idea that some ideas are dangerous, that reminds me of The Coddling of the American Mind that I've been reading for that next book club chat, where there's this mentality on college campuses where some people, they want to get rid of some ideas because those ideas make them feel uncomfortable. So therefore they only want ideas around that they're comfortable with. And that's just like we were talking about earlier. That's just not good for especially the future of society, because these people at the universities will, at least presumably, go on to be thought leaders and maybe even political leaders in society. And if they don't have an open mind about being open to idea sex, then regardless of what your biases are, that's probably not good for the future of society.
Yeah, I never really understood why it was so dangerous, considering we have like 20 million Netflix shows about serial killers, and nobody's complaining about those. And we pretty much know everything there is about Charlie Manson and his writings, and nobody's like saying, oh, you can't read this because he said X, Y, and Z. But another thing to really parallel with what you said, Andrew, with Mein Kampf is that I read Elliot Rodger's manifesto. And it's not because I was interested in what he was saying. I just wanted to see what kind of life experience could have molded somebody into the being he ended up turning into. And that manifesto, I did learn a lot. Like, he sounds very much of how you described Hitler. He was socially isolated. At school, he was somewhat bullied. And he really just kind of stayed in his own mind and tried to find blame for what he found to be ills that he was experiencing.
Yeah, that reminds me, I'm going to read the Unabomber manifesto for an upcoming podcast that I'm going to do. And I bet that's going to be in the same way, a really interesting perspective for how someone, in the case of the Unabomber, how someone really intelligent can get to the point where he removes himself from society and then starts sending bombs to people in the mail.
Yeah. Well, and one thing that I just thought of too is I think that what people, when they say that certain ideas are dangerous or whatever, I think what they're really saying without maybe either understanding or knowing what they're saying is how powerful the emotion of awe is. You know, it's the most, as Adam Hansen says, we're playing drinking game at home. Every time I mention Adam Hansen, take a drink. You, it's the most viral emotion in the world. You know, advertisers know this. This is why they put Michael Jordan next to a hamburger, or Taylor Swift tells people to register to vote, and it crashes the website. So awe is super powerful.
Or Kanye meets Trump and no one stops talking about it.
Yeah. I don't know. Is that awe? I don't know what that is.
It's awe for some people. It's hatred for other people.
Yeah, controversy maybe. But yeah, and so it's like we do have to be cognizant of the stories that we're telling, and know that everything is a story, and there's many sides. And so if we're just going to tell the same story about Winston Churchill over and over and over again, and then leave out the part where he was responsible for the genocide of 3 million Indians, it's going to be a mind fuck when people finally find that out.
I didn't even know that. That's a mindgasm and a half.
Yeah, there was a recent controversy on Twitter because Gabby Gifford's husband, whose name I can't think of right now, quoted Winston Churchill, and then a bunch of people on Twitter attacked him because they were like, Winston Churchill is not a saint, and then he apologized for it or whatever. But the whole point is, awe is very powerful, so we need to keep that in mind and constantly break down these genius myths. It doesn't mean that everything Winston Churchill did was terrible. Obviously, I'm American. I'm super happy that he helped defeat the Nazis. Like, I've seen Man in the High Castle. I don't want that. So it's like, I don't want to say everything he did is terrible by any stretch of the imagination. But,
I thought he's a person.
He's a person. He's a human that did good and bad things. And I'm open to other people's perspective, especially if they're from India and they're like, to me, he's Hitler. He's, whatever.
Yeah, to some people, Gandhi is Hitler.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was allegedly a pedophile, right? Or it was a pedophile.
Well, people people in South Africa don't like him.
Really?
Yeah, well, it's because there was some. So when there were colonies, like English colonies in Africa, and Gandhi was there, he was not happy that he was being lumped into the group of Africans. So okay. Africans didn't really like that, as if, that, because if you think about it, they're coming from, it makes sense, because in Indian society, there's kind of this caste system, and he goes over to Africa, they're sending labor over to Africa, Indian immigrants, and the Indian immigrants feel like the Africans are basically the untouchables, and that the Indians are in that same group. So he started some of his social movements because of that. But instead of lifting up the Africans, at the same time, the Indians, he was only concerned about being above them at that point.
Oh, that's interesting. That reminds me of in terms of bringing down genius myths. Like for example, a lot of people know about how Martin Luther King Jr. cheated on his wife a lot, which doesn't negate anything positive that he did, but it means that he's human like the rest of us. And in the same way as how Nelson Mandela talks about in his autobiography that he wanted to become a violent revolutionary to end apartheid, but people in his life who were engineering this revolution with him talked him down from becoming violent.
Yeah, there's a lot of the people we revere have a lot of flaws.
Yeah.
You know, most like Malcolm X, like he was very divisive in his when when in his beginnings and his writings and his appearances on television, he is extremely divisive, especially towards, you know, white people and whatnot. But after he made a trip and saw that, oh, okay, there's people of all skin colors here coming together for the same reason, and this is, you know, when he took his trip to Mecca, he kind of saw something greater than an us versus them dynamic, and he tried to see that, okay, there's something inherent in this religion that anybody can be a part of, and he shouldn't be so divisive against another race because of what he experienced in a specific part of the world when he was growing up.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. That reminds me of another one of those, you know this, Dusty, one of the three untruths in that book, The Coddling of the American Mind, is that people are good and evil, which is that sort of mindset. And that's interesting how Malcolm X got rid of that mindset in himself.
Yeah, he evolved from that young mindset, and he saw, you know, he went to prison. You know, he was kind of a knucklehead when he was young. He found religion in prison, but then he didn't shed some of the ideas about, you know, us versus them, and it wasn't until he made his pilgrimage to Mecca that he saw that, okay, we have brothers and sisters of all skin tones. You know, this is something to strive for.
Wait, are you saying that when he was in prison he had idea sex with a bunch of different people?
Yeah.
Well, he had idea sex because he found religion.
Yeah.
Definitely found a way to improve himself, but he did not quite get there because he was still, you know, there were still sects of Islam in the United States that were kind of pretty divisive, and you can find this in any religion. You know, there are some sects of religion that really hammer in division, and then there are some sects that really hammer in unity, and it really just depends on which religious leaders you kind of clamp onto in the beginning. And that's also a case when you're not broadly experienced with how people interact with each other in different regions of the world.
Yeah, that also reminds me that more helpful common humanity mindset that you were talking about there is that reminds me of that video that you told me about and then you posted on the Facebook group with Hawk Newsom, who's the New York leader of Black Lives Matter, where he went to a Trump rally and they let him speak, and he used common humanity throughout it. Like, he was talking about how we all come from the same country and all that kind of stuff, and we need to solve these problems together and understand that both sides have concerns, but by working together is how we're going to solve these problems. And then this guy who was a really harsh or a really steadfast Trump supporter and really hated Black Lives Matter, at the end of that speech, he got Hawk Newsom to take a picture with his son. So that's a great story about that too.
Yeah, I'm always seeing these examples of whenever we stop the divide, good stuff always comes out of it. It's like, I don't know, it's really a part of human psychology that we just have to be cognizant of, that we do have this innate human psychology that tribalizes and pits our tribe against another tribe instead of trying to find the commonality and work towards that commonality.
For sure.
Well, yeah, it gets back to the Orange Belt, right? Like we can't avoid tribalism. We just have to figure out ways to manage it. You know, our brains are only so big, our frontal cortexes are only so big. We can only handle so many relationships, and we care about so many things. And our world is getting bigger slash smaller, depending on how you want to look at it, all the time. And we're just going to have to start innovating ways to deal with that. And one of the best ways is telling stories, you know? One thing that our comrade, our mixed mental art buddy, Nate McCabe, always says, which I think is brilliant, is that empathy dissolves culture. So when the Black Lives leader gets to speak to Trump supporters and really emphasizes their shared humanity, creates that empathy, it dissolves those cultural lines, those imaginary lines that we think exist, and suddenly we realize we're all on the same team. Exactly. And this is really what the best part about the internet is. Like, if we could all just, you know, I like to fight online too every once in a while. Like, you know, as much as I say all this stuff, it's like, I have my beliefs, I have my feelings, and I start to get very attached to them. But then I have to remember, like, hey, Dustin, Andrew, like, they all have different ideas than me, and I love hanging out with them. I love talking to them. And my world has been so enhanced by all the people that have different ideas and beliefs that I get to talk to all the time and learn from them when I talk to them with curiosity, rather than trying to convince them to join my club that I already belong to. Like, basically having idea sex with different people. Like, this is what the internet is most power. Like, this, if we could make this happen on the internet all the time instead of people just shooting each other down, like, we would have that world that we want, that all of us wants, the better world.
I get into idea sparring instead of idea sex too often too.
Yeah. It's hard, you know, it's like Destiny said, like, we're all tribal and we can't help that. And now we've got this new tool where it just kind of ramps up our tribal tendencies because I can't see who the person is that I'm talking to. I can't hear their voice. They might be writing something hours or days ago and like a whole bunch of things have changed since then for them, but I don't know. I just see the sentence that they wrote and I respond. And
it's kind of like how some militant atheists take holy books like the Bible or the Quran literally. Like, they don't consider how this is integrated into a person's culture if they become Muslim or Christian or Buddhist or any other type of religion, and what was going on throughout that historical period when those books were written, and what was going on in the lives of the people who wrote those books that contributed to them writing those books in that way, and whether they would have agreed with everything they wrote, like if they were still alive now or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I wanted to give people some practical ideas too, practical steps that they could take to become better innovators slash idea sex havers. So just because I happen to have it right here, I keep it by my bedside, just kidding. This is Adam Hence's book, Outsmart Your Instincts. And this book will help you understand the cognitive biases that you have, where they came from, and how to better manage them and overcome them and prime yourself for hearing other ideas outside of your echo chamber, dangerous ideas, scary ideas, kinky ideas, whatever you want to call them. And then we already talked about Alan Gannett's book, The Creative Curve. That is a really fun, succinct book about how to bring different things together. He talked about songwriters and how they have figured out how to make something familiar enough that you like it, but also new enough that it feels fresh and exciting and it goes viral. And he shows the same pattern with Ben and Jerry's, with entrepreneurs, with all sorts of different fields. So especially if you want to be in creative field, but even if you're in a field that you don't think of as creative, there's always a creative aspect to it. So that's a great book on how to learn some specific tips and tools on how to be better at combining different ideas. And then also the Culture Code, which we've talked about a lot. That one specifically will help you create a successful group, because obviously you can only have so much idea sex by yourself. Like, you're going to have way better idea sex if you're drawing from a bunch of people, like, and so
it's
how you can
clear when people are idea masturbating.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's okay every once in a while, but like, you really want to go out and have idea sex.
Yeah.
But you can't beat the real thing or whatever. But yeah, and so that's all about how do you create a successful group, or in other words, how do you create this psychological safety so that everybody feels okay failing, making mistakes, throwing ideas out there, bouncing ideas off of each other. Like, how do you create that? And one of the examples that we've used a lot is Kahneman and Tversky. They won the Nobel Prize for innovating economics. Oh my gosh. This is when I wish Hunter were here. But I'm pretty sure it was economics. I think they combined psychology and economics together. Basically, the point of that is that they had a great partnership, a great relationship, went on to win the Nobel Prize, and then the trust, the respect started eroding in their relationship, and their intellectual marriage was over. And so the Culture Code goes through all these different patterns of successful groups and teaches you what you can do, whether it's in your own family, you want to create a successful family group, or it's at work, or it's a creative partnership, whatever it is, you can learn the tips and tools for that. And do you guys have anything to add about those?
A real idea safe space is what that is.
Yeah. Yeah, you want an idea safe space where you feel psychologically safe, but not necessarily safe, like
safe from
you're
ideas
protected from the scary,
yeah.
dangerous. Oh, and I was going to say, all those three people that I mentioned, all those three authors, Adam Hansen, Alan Gannett, and Dan Coyle, were all on the Mixed Mental Arts podcast. So you can check through the archives to find them. If you want like a Vorspiel into your book reading or whatever.
Yes, definitely check them out.
Yeah.
Oh, what I was going to say?
Yeah.
Yeah, there has to be a right balance. You don't want to feel entirely safe, but you want to feel safe enough to experiment and not be made to feel bad that you're entertaining an idea for the sake of entertaining an idea. I think one of the things that, especially when people are battling over ideas and things, that it's fine to do these as battling over the ideas themselves, but once it gets personal, then that's when things have gone too far.
Yeah, I mean, your idea is not your limb. So, if you have a bad idea, you just throw it away. and people move on. I mean, one of the things that we've talked a lot about is yes-anding, and they do this. It's an improv idea. In fact, Adam Hansen passes out when he does his ideation sessions, which are basically just guided brainstorming sessions where he really helps you learn really great ways to brainstorm and innovate better. It's amazing. He passes out stickers that say "no but" with an X through them, like a line through them. And yes-anding is this idea in improv where somebody will throw out an idea, oh, there's aliens about to attack us. And if the other person, their partner, says, no, there's not, that's not gonna create an improv scene or an improv show, because there's nowhere to go from no. If the person's like, yes, and they all have the heads of Tom Cruise, and then the other person is like, yes, and then they're, goes on and on and on, and like the yes and so that works in improv. It works in any kind of creative idea sex thing. It's like if someone brings you their their tomatoes. I don't know, I'm trying to think of like a food version. If somebody brings you their Mexican burrito and you're like, oh, this is great. What if we added Korean barbecue to it? And all you was like, no, I hate Korean barbecue. No, thank you. Well, there you go. All you have is a Mexican burrito that already exists. But if you're like, yes, and what if we added this? And yes, and what if we did this? Then you eventually get to that successful final product of the Kogi barbecue, which is delicious.
What would you say that cultural appropriation is innovation?
I would.
Yeah. So, or it's at least idea sex, right? And so
that's for sure,
Dustin, because I think what makes cultural appropriation, or bad, is when you do it without respect, without creating that psychological safety or whatever, paying respect, not trying to. It's the idea that of the Kahneman and Tversky example, where it's like when you give credit where credit is due, people appreciate that. Like Roy Choi doesn't go around saying, I invented food trucks. I invented this Korean barbecue. When you listen to him, he is so humble. He is like talking constantly about how he learned from these Mexican women who were cooking, and like learned from different people, learned from working in kitchens. He learned from everywhere. And you hear that again and again also in Alan Gannett's book, where he talks about these great innovators and how they are giving credit where credit is due, and they're leading with curiosity, and they're not trying to say like, I'm a genius, I made, I did this, I made this. They're giving that credit. And so I think that's the difference between good idea sex and cultural appropriation. If you want to say appropriation is a bad term, because it's like, if I just started, invented my own martial art, and I was like, this is Kate Ioki. I don't know. Kate, we'll think of a different name some other time, but like, it's, Kate Fu or whatever. And I was just like, I did this, I'm the best, whatever. And I didn't at all credit that like, oh, there's a whole Eastern tradition of martial arts that I'm drawing on and stuff like that. Like, that would be shitty of me. I would be an asshole. And nobody would want to play with me, because they'd be like, she just steals ideas and doesn't give credit where credit is due. But if we do, like Bruce Lee said, and learn from everywhere, take what is useful, discard what's not, and add what's uniquely our own, and stay humble and pay homage and give credit, then more people will want to have idea sex with us, and we'll keep innovating.
For sure. And similarly to yes-anding, something fairly similar to that Adam Hansen also brought up before the last time he was on my podcast and joined my conversation about religion with Ed Kennedy, Sam's Bulldog, who's an atheist, and Hayden Bruce, who's a Christian, is this idea of steel manning, which is presenting someone's opinion in the most charitable possible way, as if you actually believe it yourself, which is the opposite of straw manning, supposedly. Well, not exactly, but in a way, kind of the opposite of just saying that someone has an idea that they don't even have.
Yeah. So are you saying, kind of giving people the benefit of the doubt, like not attacking their idea, but trying to help lift it up?
Yeah, like assuming that people have good faith and good intentions in their arguments. Like I see that as a big problem when we're criticizing other people, or people in general do that. They kind of just assume that they know this person who they're criticizing. They know that their intentions are bad. And usually people probably have good intentions, or at least that's a good assumption to make, because it's a better way to have idea sex and innovate with people when you assume that they have good faith. I brought this up in a video that I made recently, where it was about loving your enemy, and it was the idea that, like, for example, I don't like Trump, and obviously lots of people don't like Trump either, but I really do think that he wants to make America great again. He's just kind of lazy about it.
No comment.
He doesn't know.
I like that idea though. I like that idea because, what is, was it Kofi Annan who said, and maybe he got it from somewhere, where the best way to destroy your enemy is to make them a friend, or the fastest way to destroy your enemy is to make them a friend.
Yeah.
And that goes back to what Daryl Davis is doing and what happened with the kid from Stonefront. But yeah, I love that idea of helping steel man somebody's idea, to make it more, to fortify it, to help.
And it reminds me of Hanlon's razor too, that it's something like, do not attribute to malice what can be attributed to ignorance. Because I think a lot of the time when people attribute malice to someone, it's in terms of their intentions. It's really that they actually just don't know about whatever knowledge contradicts the claims that they're making. They think that they're right often. I mean, people lie for sure, but I think it's much more often the case that people are just ignorant about why they're wrong about what they're saying.
Yeah, I mean,
would you also say that when interpreting somebody's words, it's always best to go towards the more charitable interpretation than the worst possible interpretation that it could be? It seems that a lot of our online discourse kind of revolves around hearing words and taking the worst possible interpretation of those words, and turning that into an angry and emotional mob of people, instead of just say, hey, maybe that person that is a little ignorant of what they're saying, but it doesn't mean that they are directing malice towards you. It just means they just don't know really what they're saying, and that can possibly cause offense, but it doesn't mean that that person is, Hitler.
For sure. Yeah. Like I heard on a podcast recently, this reminded me of my own opinion of Trump, similar opinion of Trump, basically, that I think he's an intellectually lazy, incompetent asshole, but he's not Orange Hitler.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely killed fewer people. Yeah, I want, because like that's something that I need to remember all the time too. Like there's a very funny Key and Peele sketch which somebody posted on the Mixed Mental Arts page where uh, Keegan Michael Key is texting Jordan Peele about they were going to hang out later, and you see both sides, but they're of course just interacting over text, and one is taking it one way and the other one's taking it another way, and like it gets totally spun out of control because, as Anais Nin said, is that how you say it? Anais Nin said, we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. And so you're reading words through your own mind filter. And so if some word seems rude or blunt or whatever to you, and too much punctuation seems curt and whatever, it's like, you're going to take it that way. That doesn't mean that's how the person wrote it. And unfortunately, because of the way the internet works and the Dunbar number, like most people that you interact with online, you are not going to see in real life, or at least a big chunk of them. You're not going to see in real life, and you're only going to have that story that you're telling about them. And so let's just tell better stories. I mean, what does it hurt you if you assume that someone is saying things with the best of intentions, and then you find out later that no, secretly they wished you ill will? Like, I don't think it hurts you at all.
Yeah.
But I have to learn to do that too, because I'll read things and be like, oh, what a jerk. But one easy way to combat that is to just ask for clarification, right? Like, hey, did you mean that to be, what did you mean by that?
Yeah. What you were saying there in terms of how people can interpret what you say if they're just reading a text or something like that reminds me of how, like, I've gotten into arguments with my brother before because I said something in a text or I said something online, and I've capitalized words for emphasis, just literally to emphasize something. But he's assumed that when I capitalize, put something in all caps, it means that I am saying that word angrily. So he thought that I was angry when I was saying those words, when I really wasn't angry, when I was actually typing that. Which is what you were saying earlier in terms of the problem with that sort of communication, in terms of like face-to-face communication where you can see someone's body language.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe it's going to be just all of us starting to create these, cultural rules around online behavior where, don't use all caps unless you want to yell.
Yeah.
don't use punctuation unless you want to be short and curt. Different things. And it depends on who you're speaking to as well. It's like, I can text, misspellings and like half words to all my friends, but if I'm interacting with, my customers, I feel like, oh, I should use punctuation, or I use a lot of emojis because I'm like, I want to make it very clear what the emotional tone is of my words. So, there's going to be part of that where we're just all creating those rules, but also really trying to, I think maybe what we need is like a modern version of the Good Samaritan for the online world. You just have to figure that out.
For sure.
Like all these stories that cultures used for so long to remind them to treat people outside of their Dunbar number as if they were in their Dunbar number.
Like the story of the Good Samaritan, the lesson of the Good Samaritan basically is that the person who is part of the most hated member of society and goes against your own culture more than anyone else can be the only person who helps you. That reminds me again of another part of what Daryl Davis talks about in Accidental Courtesy, about how there was this, I think it was a Nazi, or it was either a Nazi or a white supremacist, and he was in prison, and Daryl Davis literally paid to have his family sent up to him to see him in prison, and no one else did that, not even anyone else in his white supremacist group or whatever. And then that was the gateway to him becoming friends with Daryl Davis and eventually leaving his white supremacy group.
Yeah. Yeah, and like you know, maybe you don't feel comfortable going quite that far, but
yeah, I don't think I would do that.
You know? Well, I mean, he had probably met the guy. I don't know the story, but he had probably met the guy and talked to him and maybe felt some kind of like, oh, if I were in prison and I couldn't see my family, that would be so hard for me. And that's what drove him to do that. You know, that empathy, dissolving the cultural lines between them. I have a little story about my cousin, who I've talked about a little bit on these chats and stuff. He and I don't live in the same state. We don't see each other very often at all, like, you know, every decade or something. So not very often. And but I generally have good feelings towards him. He's younger than me, and you know, he's my cousin. I like him. But we're very different politically, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was retweeting just stuff on Twitter. I was particularly upset about the way that our government handled the Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, because like I said, I lived on a boat in the Caribbean and spent a good chunk of time in Puerto Rico, and very much Puerto Rico to me is part of the United States. I have great memories of it. My parents loved it so much they were thinking about moving there, which we didn't move to Puerto Rico. But yeah, I love Puerto Rico. And so I felt very sad and upset about the way the post-hurricane situation was handled. And so I was retweeting stuff about that. And he started replying angrily to my retweets. And at one point, I finally just said, hey, did I do something to piss you off? Like, why are you yelling at me? And he just said, oh, I'm not yelling at you. I'm just mad about this thing in our government or whatever. And so at that point, I was like, okay, here's our mutual connection, because we're both upset about the government, maybe for different reasons, different things. But, you know, so let's talk about that. And so then instead of trying to argue sides with him, we just started talking to him and asking him how he was doing and stuff like that. And then I recently saw him at a wedding, and we had a great time talking. And I'm so glad that I got to see him. My mom, on the other hand, argues with him online. And they did not have a great time at the wedding. So, you know, so I think cutting people some slack and, like, I don't know the point of the story is, except that let's use empathy to dissolve culture. You know,
I think with family members, sometimes it can be more difficult too. At least this is what I've found. Sometimes with family members, it can be harder to let go of your biases and see their side of an argument, because you know that they'll love you regardless of what you do, unless you like try to kill them or something like that. So it can be easier to be more harsh with them. At least this is what I've found, and that with other people who I don't know as well, I'm more prone to being more careful about the way I criticize them than I sometimes can be with family members. If I know that I can talk to them in a harsh way and we can have arguments, but we'll never stop loving each other.
Yeah, well, I think that's about established psychological safety, right? Like, you feel safe with your family members because you have a strong bond with them. You know that no matter what they say, you know, you'll always love each other. I don't think everybody's family is like that. And like I said, like my cousin, we don't see each other very much. So we don't really have that strong psychological safety bond, whatever you want to call it. But I know enough about his life to understand where a lot of his beliefs have come from and how different my life has been. Like I said, I have spent time in Puerto Rico. He's never been to Puerto Rico. To him, all he hears is that they don't pay federal taxes and they don't deserve federal help. And like, I have a different story about Puerto Rico. But I was able to say, okay, I understand where he is coming from. I don't agree with it. I'm not going to waste time trying to argue points with him. I'm just going to focus on creating a stronger psychological a safe bond between us. And then maybe one day he'll want to revisit the topic of Puerto Rico and he'll be more open to what I have to say, rather than my mom just arguing with him and then they see each other in real life and they don't want to talk, you know, like they don't want to be near each other. And I think, yeah, I think, I don't know. I don't know what I think. What do you think, Dustin? You're so quiet.
About Puerto Rico?
No. Just about, you know, I think part of the reason that we keep spending so much time on this and talking about it so much is, one, this is essential. Like getting out of your echo chamber and talking to people that disagree with you or have different ideas, different cultural beliefs than you do, is essential for innovation, for having better idea sets and therefore becoming a better innovator and having more successful innovations. And also, it's super hard. It's super hard to be confronted with these ideas that go against everything you feel to be true and not want to like, no, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. Like it's really, really hard. And that's why the world is kind of a shit show right now, because there's not enough people like Jonathan Haidt that have mastered this technique, myself included. Like I'm baby stepping my way into trying to do better, but I still like get into fights with people all the time.
Yeah, I totally understand what you mean, because I kind of get in fights with people all the time on the Facebook group.
Yeah, but, I do that too often too.
I don't do it out of malice. Like I'm trying to get people to understand me better in the way I think, not necessarily. I'm not trying to punish people for the way they think. What I want to do, and sometimes I don't really clearly explain myself, or there's just a lot of emotion. Like I'll try to start a conversation with like a controversial saying, but I don't really entirely mean it. I just want to get people talking about an issue to see what they think. Because I know a lot of... Well, the reason I do that on Mixed Metal Arts is it seems like the most controversial conversations or topics spark the most conversation. And like, I guess I'll give an example from me that I posted recently, that I blame Bernie Sanders for my recent issue with getting some hours for my job. Ultimately, I'm not dumb enough to think that Bernie Sanders is the sole cause of it. There's a lot of different factors that went into the issues that I'm experiencing, and it's more complex than simply blaming a sum total of my issues on one person. But it also gets people kind of initially interested in the conversation, and then I can kind of fully flesh out, different reasons, just see how people will react to it. Do they react to it as an against me thing, or trying to make other considerations? Like, for instance, there are a lot of people, instead of outright condemning my statement by asking questions like, well, do you think did you consider this, or did you consider that? Or what do you think about this and that? And that's kind of like a lot of the great discourse that happens, is when somebody can look at my controversial statement and ask a question that basically brings out a more nuanced discussion about that statement. Because sometimes I feel like if you kind of overload people with nuance in the beginning, they kind of get lost in that, and they're kind of like, I don't really know how to respond to this. But if you come out punching a little bit, then you get people to kind of turn on their thinking caps and come to like a sparring session, knowing that I'm not trying to hurt anybody. I'm just trying to get people's brains spooled up and thinking alternatively. But yeah, I don't hate Bernie Sanders. I know, I know people probably got that impression, but I think
you're just
Bernie,
part of the genius destruction team for Bernie Sanders. That's totally okay.
Yeah,
well, I'm just thinking like there's more. Like I understand what he's trying to achieve, and I admire that. However, there are often unforeseen consequences when you broadly apply a specific solution, when you don't think of some of the consequences that can occur. And I think that's what I was trying to pull up. Like I admire his wanting to do that, but sometimes you really have to take a look at very specific circumstances and seeing if that is the right move to make. Like I liked that the warehouse workers at Amazon are getting paid paid more for such a physically grueling job that you're walking around a warehouse for 8 to 10 hours a day. They keep timers on you, so you got to get a package from one place to another in a specific time frame. Like you're always reminded about how quickly you have to get a package to a specific area in the warehouse, and that can be extremely stressful. I understand that. And if I if this was the scenario, if I was offered that job and my job at the same pay, I'd always pick my job because it's 10 times less stressful, so much more easier. And I think it's just, you can't just blanket apply a rule to every single existence. There's more nuance, there's more consequences that you can not see if you're just trying to apply a blanket rule to everybody and not see that there could be some unforeseen consequence because of that.
Yeah.
That's I like what you said there in terms of the like strategies for idea sex too, because like sometimes when I'm trying to talk with someone, sometimes I'll just start off by saying, that's a bias. Here's my nuanced arguments for what both sides think and what I agree with on one side and disagree with, and what I agree with on the other side and disagree with. And sometimes it can be just like a bombardment of information to take in all at once. And then other times I might say, that's a bias. Here's the opposite bias. But just even saying that it's a bias can piss people off sometimes too.
Yeah, for sure. And it's just like when you go to college too, like some of the most interesting conversations you have with your professor, or group discussions you have in class, usually lead with a somewhat controversial and unnuanced statement, and then you guys kind of just wrestle with each other and trying to bring out some other modes of critical thinking. I know some people really immediately go into attack mode and label mode and things of that nature. But when when you try to consider more than what's presented, I think that's when conversations really start to flow, and people who are not in the know get to see, can also consider those things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think too, like, it takes lots of different ways to, like, there's lots of different ways to get good conversations going. And I think no matter which way we choose or which method we choose, one of the best things is to lead by example. You know,
lots of, oh, sorry.
Well, just to show how Hunter always says, model what you want, what behavior you want. So, you know, what you just said, Dustin, super insightful and helpful. And like, I think that's really great. Like, you know, create a little bit of controversy and then slowly get into the nuance so that people don't get lost in the weeds, and then explain your intentions.
Yeah, it's like what Hunter's experiment that didn't go so well, except I'm trying not to do it in such an antagonistic way. Like, I'm not calling out specific people in our community or pointing at them and making them feel bad about their own ideas. I usually, when I speak to people, I frame it in the way I think and how it affects me or people I may know, but I will not attack somebody for the ideas that they have. They're more than welcome to have those, but I don't try to make somebody feel that they're morally wrong for having a specific idea. Or, I don't shame people about the ideas they have. I think one of the most important things is to try not to moralize or give a moral grade to an idea that somebody has. And that's kind of when you introduce those concepts, such as morality and the way people think, that just creates a gateway for you to shame them or use some type of social pressure or telling them that they're thinking wrongly. So, that's not a tool I like to use. I try to keep morality out of it so that people are free to kind of wrestle and not feel shameful for expressing a certain idea. I know in our community, we don't have like super extreme opinions as far as people becoming white supremacists or things of that nature. But when I do sense some fringy division, I do try to show those people who have a distaste for another tribe that, hey, I might not be a part of that specific tribe, but they might have valid reasons for thinking a specific way. And we should probably try to understand that rather than to point a finger and demonize them and not talk to them and kind of cut off the stream of conversation that could be beneficial for them.
Yeah, well, and it's all about putting aside your ego that you know the right way and there's a wrong way, and just leading with curiosity and learning about the other way that people do things. It's like you're not all of a sudden going to become whatever that other group is just because you're listening to their ideas. Like you're not all of a sudden kind of a socialist if you listen to socialist ideas, especially, or a Republican if you listen to Republican ideas. Like my best friend's a Republican, and I have yet to vote Republican, and we've been friends since we were 16. So
yeah,
I listen to her ideas all the time.
It's also getting and this is kind of probably what we'll talk about next week. It's getting the idea that these ideas, just in discourse and discussing them, doesn't physically harm you. you can always talk about the merits and the consequences of specific ideas and why they have merits and consequences. But not discussing these ideas can be as dangerous as it's like letting a dangerous disease fester and grow. I think things should always be discussed, and it's better to have discussions because, like Daryl Davis says, if you're not talking, you're fighting. And
or you're going off to find people that are like-minded, and you're just festering those bad ideas. You know?
Yeah, you're doing the opposite of idea sex. You're just kind of staying in your echo chamber. And that's why I go out of my way. Like, I've gone out of my way to listen to podcasts that people like Richard Spencer have been on. I've went out of my way to check out Stefan Molyneux and all these people that are supposed to be super dangerous and hurtful to your psyche. But I think it's better that I understand what they're coming from, what they're saying, rather than not discuss it or be exposed to it. Like, you have to create a mental immune system in order to, like, the more you build your mental immune system, the better ability that you have to discuss these ideas. And I think that's maybe something we have lacking. It's just we don't, with the younger generations, they just don't have this mental immune system that allows them to tackle these type of ideas and not feel unsafe about just discussing how they're bad to somebody who might be on the other side of the political spectrum. Like, you can always, like, if we're going to talk about just, you know, barring speech from public discourse, it's always good to express to that person why they're bad and give them a piece of your mind, than not have that discussion take place at all.
Yeah, just dismiss them without hearing what they have to say.
Yeah, and it gives people, you know, like it builds your mental immune system to be able to encounter these things. Like, we can't have a society where just I'll give a Wheel of Times reference. Like, they can't speak the name of the Dark One.
Yeah.
So if they can't, like, speaking the name of the Dark One is such an evil and impactful sin that they have no immune system to it.
Well, and isn't that giving the Dark One, this evil genius, so much power? Like, you listen to Richard B. Spencer talk, and I mean, I haven't listened to him that much, but a little bit, and he talks about how his parents aren't happy with him, whatever. Like, he sounds totally mundane to me sometimes when I listen to him. I'm just like, okay. And that's why when Hunter started calling him Emo Kylo Ren, I was like, yeah, that's what he sounds like to me. He's not scary. He's not like the next Hitler. He's just this emo, angry guy with a funny haircut who was like, whatever, you know? And like, I think I love that idea of strengthening your, what did you call it? Your mental immunity.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same idea of conquering your fear of failure, conquer your fear of listening to ideas outside of your belief system.
Yeah.
Like, conquer your fear of cognitive dissonance. You know, like, you listen to it and then you're like, oh, okay, the world hasn't ended. You know, cats and dogs aren't playing together and monkeys falling from the sky. I don't know, whatever the expressions are where like everything's going crazy. Like, that doesn't happen. You just listen to it. And then the other thing I wanted to say too is, you know, we already know so much about how facts don't change people's minds, and whether they're true facts or false facts, it's all about what you already believe. So why are we wasting our time trying to argue facts with each other? Like, why don't we spend more time getting to know each other? Like, hey, where did this idea that you have come from? Or, even if you don't want to be that specific, like, hey, we both like music. Let's talk about music. Or we both like food. Let's talk about food. And instead of like hitting our heads against each other's heads constantly, trying to convince each other that we see the whole elephant and they don't, like, realize that none of us sees the whole elephant and that we have to get information from each other.
Yeah. I think it's a really good idea to do what you were both just talking about there, and seek out ideas that you fear. So like for example, I'm annoyed by any sort of like political extremism, so I try to watch both progressive and conservative podcasts, like you were talking about, Dusty, because I don't really agree with any sort of political ideology like that. But once you, like you were both just talking about there, once you actually start entertaining and investigating those ideas, for me, and I'm sure for a lot of people too, you always find that there are some of their ideas that make sense, and some of their lives and how they contribute to their ideas often make sense. It's like how it's like I was talking the other day with Ledan Juracek, who's in mixed mental arts, about how any perspective can be logical. Like, according to your life, you can think that your ideas are logical, even if you're a terrorist, for example. Like, if you, for example, lived in Syria and the imperialist Americans invade your country, and then these Muslim tribes come and take over your town, and then they take your family hostage, and they say, okay, join our terrorist group or we're going to execute your entire family in front of you right now. What the fuck would you do? Probably join a terrorist group.
Or the US bombs all of your family and your friends.
Yeah.
And, then all of a sudden you have a good reason to hate the US.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's this really interesting podcast I should probably refer you guys to. It's called The Caliphate. Not the Callan Fate, but The Caliphate. It's a New York Times podcast. I think it's a 6-part series about ISIS. And the weird and funny thing about the podcast is there were actually some pros to being an ISIS-conquered area. But of course,
I'm sure.
Yeah. You would think about it as like, really? They got rid of a bunch of corrupt politicians who were stealing people's money. But there were also some bad things that came with it, like, sexual assault and human trafficking.
Yeah.
So
didn't they also pay a lot of their quote unquote soldiers, that people
they
that
actually paid their people pretty well. Like they gave people more input into infrastructure issues and stuff like that.
Yeah, and so, staying on the theme of idea sex, it's like you start to see the tactics. That's where the whole idea of the Callan Fate came from, or like Nisus, that Hunter started talking about, is what tactics can we use that ISIS is using, because they are spreading their message very quickly and constantly filling up their members as, their other ones die. So what tactics are they using that we can use, but for good instead of for bad?
Well, the funny thing is, at first they put a really nice face on to the communities that they were taking over. And they were actually improving the lives of some people, such as getting consistent energy generation, trash pickup, all the stuff you would expect that a city would do for a citizen. But
isn't that the same as the mafia? Isn't that the
yeah,
same that Pablo Escobar did?
Yep. Kind of, and then, but they weren't really privy to the extreme nature of how they executed their Islamic law, and there were quite some horrible things that some people just didn't know about. Like, I think one of the things was just like sex slavery was completely okay if the person that they're selling into sex slavery was not part of any of the Abrahamic religions.
Yeah. Well, isn't that the same with murder too? Like, even if you're Muslim, but you're not as, part of their belief system, like it's okay to kill you.
Well, it would be okay if they broke some type of Islamic law, like, but even then,
they didn't recognize the caliphate or whatever it was.
Well, even then, in that podcast series, one of the people who was actually part of ISIS saw that there were a lot of contradictions to what they were teaching. So it was, when people get too powerful, and especially in that case, they became much more authoritarian, and it was very hard for them to rationalize why they were doing specific things in a way that was palatable to everybody.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Good recommendation. The Caliphate podcast. I'll check it out.
I wrote that down.
I have to run to work, so I have to leave you guys. But this was super fun. I love the brown belt because really it's all just about getting to know other people and other ideas and talking and having a good time.
All right. Well, thank you, Kate, for coming on. It looks like, I don't know what happened to Alex. I guess he just couldn't get on.
Yeah. But, too bad.
Yeah, that's too bad. And thank you for your cat and your bald friend there. That's
a boyfriend.
That's
don't know if he posted he's on camera, but but yeah, you guys have a great rest of your night, and I will talk to you again for the red belt.
Yes.
Next month.
All right. Do you have anything to plug, Kate, before you leave?
No, just the 3 books that I mentioned: Outsmart Your Instincts by Adam Hansen, The Creative Curve by Alan Gannett, and the Culture Code by Dan Coyle. And then somebody in the YouTube chat asked about the restaurant that I had mentioned, the pop-up restaurant. It's called Pop Cultivate. So if you're in the LA area or visiting LA, you can look that up. They might have a website, but they're definitely on Instagram, I think. So just Google Pop Cultivate cannabis infused food. So that's all I've got. And I will talk to you guys soon. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Kate.
Bye.
Bye.
Great to talk to you, Kate.
All right, Andrew, did you have any plug-a-roos?
Yeah, sure. If people want to, they can check out my YouTube channel where I do podcasts with people. Like I've talked to Kate and Dusty before, and lots of other interesting people on my YouTube channel. And I make videos about ideas and read my chapters of my novel on there too. And then there's also that's set on Mindgasms on YouTube. And I also have my blog, mindgasms.theblogpress.com, where I write about ideas, and I also release chapters of my novel and short stories and poems on there sometimes. And if people want to contribute to me on Patreon, that would be awesome too, at Mindgasms. And then I'm also on the social medias. the Facebooky boo-ha and the Twitter at Andrew Meintzer. And I have that weird German spelling of my last name, Meintzer. And yeah, that's it.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. And for Mixed Mental Arts, you could always visit our Facebook group at mixedmentalarts.com. Oh, that's our webpage. The webpage is mixedmentalarts.online. You can check out the different belts there and the belt tests. You can check us out on Facebook, where we have a lot of controversial discussions. They get pretty heated, but nobody really pisses each other. Some people might get pissed off, but not many. You can check out our podcast as well. We have a very fun podcast where we talk about some really interesting topics, and a lot of it has to do with a lot of people coming from different cultures and seeing how they work and live. On Twitter, check us out at Mixed Mental Arts, and Instagram, also at Mixed Mental Arts. I also like to thank all of our patrons for helping support our efforts here at Mixed Mental Arts. Really, really do appreciate your donations for the show. Very much appreciated. And if you want to check out my personal stuff, I have Woke Centrist on YouTube and Twitter and Instagram. And that is it. Thank you, everybody. And I'm not to my desk yet, so it's going to be about a few more minutes before I can actually stop broadcasting. So, was there anything you wanted to talk about? Your blog, was there a new post that you might want to direct people to that you're excited about, Andrew?
Well, I guess in relation to what we were talking about today, one of my recent videos that I made on my YouTube channel is called Love Your Enemy, which is that basically religious concept in Christianity and Buddhism about it's kind of the idea that Daryl Davis practices with the idea of, befriending your enemy rather than demonizing them and seeing them as evil. So you can more easily exist with each other in your culture and innovate new ideas and whatnot in that way. And also I'm gonna talk to Kate again on my YouTube channel on Tuesday.
All right, great. And before we go out, just to let you guys know, next Saturday, we're going to talk about the coddling of the American mind by Jonathan Haidt. I'm really excited for this one.
Me too.
All right, so I hope you guys will come next week and check us out. We're going to be talking about that book. We're going to go through it pretty thoroughly, as early as we can in a little chat session. But I hope you guys show up, and it'll be fun. It's an awesome book, I promise you.
Yeah.
All right, so goodbye, everybody. Thanks for watching.
Adios until next time. Praise Odin.